So I'd like to welcome all of you to this research seminar on the survival of the secret treaty. And it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Dr. Megan Donaldson, who's lecturer in public international law at University College London. Megan works in the field of public international law, its theory and history. Her historical work has examined the development of the international legal order over the 19th and 20th centuries, and she has a special interest in the interwar foundations of the present international order. She's interested in methodological dimensions of the interaction between law and history, how each approaches text and material evidence, how different scales, national, imperial, global, and strands, intellectual, social, cultural, of historical scholarship might engage differently with law, and the possibilities for more fruitful collaboration between these fields in the future, something I certainly can agree with. Dr. Donaldson is the author of a study in the history of treaty making, the survival of the secret treaty, publicity, secrecy, and legality in the international order, which won the Francis Deac Prize in 2017 by the American Society of International Law for the leading article by a younger author in the American Journal of International Law. Having written the definitive study on secret treaties, Megan is now working on a book tracing secrecy and publicity in the international legal order, which is under contract with OUP. She's also a co-editor, formerly co-editor with Annabelle Brett and Marty Koskaniemi, sorry, I can never pronounce that name correctly, entitled History, Politics, Law, Thinking Through the State, which was published last year. Her main future project is on the conceptualization of peace and peacemaking, particularly the fault line between scholarship on imperial governance and on peace agreements between European powers. Other current work includes a chapter on legal thought in the early League of Nations and research into the absence of prosecutions of Italian forces for atrocities committed in Ethiopia. Prior to her academic career, Megan worked in corporate litigation and served as an associate to Justice Hayne of the High Court of Australia. She holds degrees in law and history from the University of Melbourne. She holds an LLM and a JSD from NYU. And following completion of her LLM, she was a research fellow in NYU's Institute for International Law and Justice. And from 2015 to 2019, she was junior research fellow in the history of international law at King's College, Cambridge, and the Lauderpack Center for International Law. Megan, it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to eBay, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, let me start with some thanks. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to Jeff for inviting me into the Institute. It's a pleasure also to be talking about this work again. So for context, as Jeff mentioned, a lot of what I'm going to say today draws on research I did for my doctorate, some of which has been published in the American Journal of International Law. But I'm circling back to this work now as part of putting a larger book project together. And that's why it's interesting to kind of revisit some of the findings and think about how they might be drawn out or developed into a larger argument. So very interested to think about interdisciplinary perspectives and the different way that IR or politics and political science scholars might approach some of these issues. Without further ado, let me just outline a little bit what I want to talk about today. So first, a few words on the overarching project, the book scale project, the guiding questions, the methods. Then I'll move to the detail of the work on treaties, just headline the key findings, say a little something about the legal context for people who might not be lawyers, and then sketch a little bit of what I found about the law and the practice and the attitudes over time. And I'll finish with summarizing what I think are the insights from this treaties work for my larger project and what might come out of this in terms of challenges for interdisciplinary research on secrecy, both in the area of treaty making and in the legal order more generally. The project started actually because I had been working in the area of transparency in global governance. And I became a little bit jaded with the ubiquity of this rhetoric about transparency and with the pretty undefined normative foundations of why we think transparency is a good thing. So that's what prompted the move to a more historical register, and to go back and actually think what were the more precise ideals and visions that animated some of the early movements towards publicity or transparency in the international legal order, and then really track through the detail of what happened to those. So the most obvious starting point is one with which I think probably many of you will be familiar, and that's these radical calls for open diplomacy by liberal democracies in the aftermath of World War I. So it's building on a sentiment which had also existed in earlier periods, but it was really sharpened and I guess generalized by the experience of the war. And I guess on the left flank, you could say there was also perhaps even more far-reaching demands for publicity and openness from the Bolsheviks as part of a kind of performative revolutionary politics, but it was also taken up as a priority for liberal democracies as well. It's quite a complex body of thinking, actually, this liberal internationalist body of thinking, and we could talk more about what actually makes up the assumptions, but just for the purposes of tracking today, I'd say there's the underlying core of the idea is that there's a connection between publicity, in the sense of making things public, to a general public, legality, having law as the basis of international order, and more peaceful relations between states. Right? Those are the things that are thought to go together. And they're then opposed, on the other hand, to a combination of secrecy, illegality, or kind of essentially force as the basis of order, and the sorts of things which were associated with secret treaty making in the minds of these liberal internationalists, including a sort of tendency to rivalrousness, to uncertainty, and to aggression. So that would be a kind of caricatured view of the impulse that was present in 1919. It's an impulse which was translated into law in some respects, and I was interested for the overarching project in tracking what happened to that commitment to open diplomacy in the realm of law and why. So that shapes very much the kind of work that I did. I didn't go into this thinking, why is secrecy attractive or not attractive, and what effects does it have? I was looking more at the evolution of the legal position, but those questions all intersect, and I think it's a fruitful basis for speculation on some of the larger issues. I think the answer to what happened to this commitment to open diplomacy matters, right? It matters both for our understanding of what's going on in the world today, because there is this rhetoric of transparency everywhere, and it is not actually tracking the reality of what's occurring, and for our normative thinking. So I said I found the case for transparency as a general kind of ideal of governance pretty fluid, and I think that we could do with some sharper thinking about what actually are the normative ideals that we're trying to attain. And hopefully understanding better what's actually happening now is a stronger basis for that normative thinking. So those are kind of questions that animate the whole project. When I started the project, I had to think actually about how to design the research. And I'll just sketch now the choices that I made, so at least you have a sense of the other things that we might talk about beyond treaties. I thought I needed to look at the bodies of international law that have particular bearing on secrecy and publicity. So treaty making is an obvious one, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it's distinct as an area in a second. But the law of diplomatic relations is really important. A kind of uncodified settlement on secrecy present in the law of diplomatic relations. I also looked at the inner life of international organizations, because in some ways we might see treaty making and the work of international organizations as two alternate modes of cooperation, and that's, you know, the balance has obviously gone even further towards international organizations today. And I looked at the negotiations over disarmament and arms control, because that was a very kind of early area in which you saw thinking about the use of publicity, systematized publicity of statistics, as a means of governance. So it was theorized as that in the interwar period, which is, you know, a sort of early precursor to something we see now generalized everywhere. Disarmament and arms control also brings in the private sector in a way that other areas don't to the same degree. So that's interesting, thinking about corporate secrecy and state secrecy and how they intersect. I chose to focus on 3 countries, the US, the UK, and France. They are obviously all powers of relative importance. They're all democracies. They're not representative of the range of states in any way, but they're illustrative, I think, of the difficulties with publicity, because they are powers which are in a position to shape how diplomacy happens and influence the rules, and because they're powers that are committed to greater or lesser degrees to open diplomacy in the aftermath of World War I. So it's there that you're going to find the really interesting stuff of people grappling with this ideal and its limits. Looking at states which are not really committed to the ideal doesn't give you anything of the same interest. When I was tracking what happened in these bodies of law and how these states performed, I had a sort of choice about how I would do that. I guess a more conventional legal approach would have been to look at the sorts of things which count as part of the ascertainment of the legal position, and those tend to be published sources, or to a limited degree kind of preparatory work for treaties. But those published sources actually obscure more than they reveal, right, about how the norm is evolving and the difficulties that people are having. So it quickly became apparent to me that this had to be a very intensively archival project. So that's archives typically of governments, sometimes of private individuals who are officials and dealing with particular matters, archives of the League of Nations. And within governments, I focused on foreign ministries, but the arrangement of the archives in states varies. So some of the material is in Defense Department archives and some of it's in trade and commerce. It just depends how the bureaucracy is established. Using that archival material gives a really rich kind of human sense of what it is to work with these treaties and the kinds of dilemmas that arise in drafting them. But it also does have limits. So the bulk of my research was on the late 19th century to the interwar period. But obviously, if you're trying to do seriously work on the post-World War II years, you run into difficulties with archival openness. Today, there's still probably, even when archives are open, some degree of withholding of secrecy relevant material, in particularly intelligence and defense areas. And there's also, even with the open material, a problem of unevenness. So the French archives are very discreet, shall we say. A lot is taken out of those archives. The British archives, on the other hand, very voluble, right? Officials very fond of writing down their thoughts and what they're thinking, and that makes for a tremendously rich record. But the unevenness can skew, I think, the analysis of what's going on, and that's a challenge for any archival project. Okay, let me say a little something about treaty making and what's distinct about treaty making among the other bodies of law that I focus on. Again, you'll probably be familiar with the kind of post-World War I emphasis on secret treaties as a source of aggression, of uncertainty and instability. And it's worth noticing the real prominence that they had, for example, in Wilson's 14 points. Open covenants, openly arrived at, was the new order. The openly arrived at part, i.e. that you would negotiate publicly, very quickly jettisoned, and I can kind of track through that in the questions if that's of interest. But open covenants, in the sense of having treaties published, did have this huge symbolic importance. And I've quoted Wilson there, but in fact, this kind of demand was very widespread in the French and the British sort of leftist and internationalist circles as well. And it came to have this importance in part because there was a clear historical argument you could make about the genesis of war and the problematic effects of secret treaties, and because it was really tangible. Are there secret treaties or not? It's something that you can really test, whereas other aspects of the new diplomacy are much less tangible. I'll just say at the outset, what I think are the key findings when I try to work through the law and treaty making, and then I'll step through a little bit more detail. So if I took the key questions to be what happened to the commitment and why, what happened? Secrecy was not prohibited comprehensively, right? So the secret treaty remains available as a mode of legal ordering in at least some cases, right? There are, I guess we could generalize and say, greater limits on the possibilities of secrecy over time, but the possibilities which remain are quite capacious, right? And they can encompass agreements of very high degree of political salience, as well as, for example, military importance. Why did this happen? So why was there a preservation of possibilities for secrecy? As we go through the developments in more detail, you'll get a sense of this, but it's fair to say that in pretty much every instance, there's quite localized short-term incentives to keep things secret, right? So officials, governments are trying to avoid public opposition on particular questions, avoid alienating allies, avoid finding themselves faced with the same demands that they're giving into in this instance. And international officials, for example, within the Secretariat of the League of Nations, generally supportive of treaty publication, but they would prefer, if there's going to be violations of the publication requirement, that they happen quietly, so that the League isn't faced with obvious evidence of its own weakness and failure. So those kinds of incentives play quite a major role. But there is also a very important kind of re-evaluation in the minds of people who would have been in this liberal internationalist camp, who were in theory supporters of publicity, as they actually came face to face with concrete situations. They began to think through the assumptions that publicity and legality and peaceful ordering went together, and they began to have questions because they encountered situations in which it wasn't obviously the case that those relationships would hold. Importantly, this vein of kind of rethinking or reconsideration happens below the surface, right? So that argument in principle that publicity and legality and peaceful ordering tend to reinforce each other isn't openly challenged. It's just said that in particular circumstances, the rule of treaty publication is too demanding, or it doesn't fit the needs of, states at this particular point in time, something like that. And the whole kind of principle debate comes under the surface or gets lost in the legal technicality. And I think it's important to excavate, right, what's happening at the level of principle, that there is this revision at the level of principle. What I'm going to do in the bulk of the presentation is just step through how I think all this unfolded across, to put it really crudely, 4 periods. And we can get into the nuances of this perhaps in the Q&A. But as I unfold what happens, I'm kind of moving, I realize, between 3 different things, right? What's the formal legal position? What's the practice? And I don't mean this in the technical international law sense of state practice, which is a quite confined category. I mean this in the sense of what do states actually do and what do officials do and how do they think about this? And then attitudes, right? How are officials thinking about this? How are internationalist NGOs thinking about this? What's the degree of interest in the press or in the legislatures about these questions? And these things all kind of reinforce each other, particularly because, as we'll see, we're not only talking about international legal norms, but actually domestic law as well, which bears on treaty publicity. Let me just say something now about the legal technicalities to ground a little bit what I'm saying. The first point is, as I just mentioned, that there are different bodies of law which govern how one makes a treaty. So if we think about a treaty made between 2 states, the form of that treaty and how it's made will be shaped in part by international law. International law will have requirements, right? And international law can, as it has done more recently, have rules about what happens if one of the states has breached its own domestic law in making a treaty in a particular way. But then, in addition to the international law requirement, each of the states will have their own domestic law, typically constitutional law or kind of constitutional-like statutes in the case of the UK, which prescribe the extent to which the legislature gets to know what's going on and when and things like that. And typically, it's not always the case, but typically where there's a requirement for treaties to be laid before the legislature, that amounts more or less to publication to the world at large, at least in the 20th century. 19th century is a slightly different picture. So that's the bodies of law that matter. I'm going to focus mostly on international law, but I will kind of mention developments in the domestic spheres when they're relevant. The second matter of context, which is really crucial to convey, is how difficult it is to say simply what a treaty is, right? So firstly, the word treaty is used in 2 different ways. There's a general sense, written agreement between states, who agree to be legally bound, and it's an agreement under international law rather than a private law style contract to buy battleships or something of that kind. That's pretty settled, uncontroversial. There's a lot of argument in particular cases about whether a particular text is or is not a treaty, but the general concept is well understood and relatively stable over time from the 19th century to now. The second sense in which treaty is used is essentially as a subset of the general concept. So if you think of treaties with which you're familiar, you will note that they're not all called treaties. Some of them are called conventions, agreements, covenants, protocols, exchanges of notes. They're not titled at all. They're just called the Lisbon Note or the something draft, or immense profusion of different names for things. And states can call these texts whatever they like, basically. They have huge discretion about how they draft these texts. And they have discretion about how the text will come to have binding force, right? There are some agreements which come into force simply on being signed, and there are others which don't come into force until a second stage of ratification has happened. Typically the more important treaties, but not always. And where there is a legislative involvement, that often happens between signature and ratification. Open brackets, quite late in the game, right? If you actually want the legislature to have anything meaningful to say. If we look at the array of different names and at the different options that there are for bringing the treaty into effect, we can say, loosely speaking, that there's a hierarchy, right? Things that are called treaties tend to be more important, more ceremonial, have greater weight, be more generalized, long-lasting. And things that are subject to that two-stage process of ratification also tend to be up the more important, long-lasting end. But there is no necessary kind of cause and effect relationship there. And actually, things which are made on signature, very briefly, 1.5 sides of paper, can be hugely politically salient. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for secrecy because the dual senses of the word treaty provide a lot of cover to governments in debate with each other and with public kind of questions. Did you sign a secret treaty with someone? No, we didn't sign a secret treaty. The questioner is using the general concept, and the government, when it's responding, is using treaty as a term of art. That was just an exchange of notes, right? So it's that kind of play in the vocabulary which obscures a lot of what's going on. The freedom of drafting and the fact that there isn't a kind of firm form of treaties leaves open a lot of avenues for secrecy. So it's very possible, for example, to split the drafting. You have a published treaty and then you have a side letter or a protocol or something which is secret. So that's a whole diplomatic craft which is shaped by history, shaped by the precedents that diplomats have lying around, shaped by convenience. And it's through the ambiguity of the language and the flexibility of the drafting that a lot of secrecy is still enabled today. Okay, so with those preliminaries out of the way, let me turn to how things develop over time. We start in the early 20th century, essentially eve of World War I, no international law prohibition on secret treaties. International law simply doesn't have much to say about that issue. Domestic law varies, even between the three kind of democracies that I'm looking at. The US has a long-standing requirement for Senate advice and consent for what are known as Article II treaties. So again, we come back to this question of vocabulary. An American lawyer will say, an executive agreement is something that's not a treaty, but actually is a general concept, that's all treaties, right? In the UK, early 20th century, there is no requirement, actually, for laying treaties before Parliament or for publishing them. They are routinely laid before Parliament and published, but there's no requirement for that to be done. France has something more like what we call a constitutional model, because it is found in a number of other continental European jurisdictions. And that's a set of stipulations which specify that certain treaties, right, have to be subjected to legislative approval, which typically involves publication, or given effect through a law, which essentially means also discussion with the legislature and publication. If we look at the categories concerned there, peace, commerce, those involving state finances, dealing with rights and property of nationals abroad, affecting kind of territorial settlements and so on, you might think that that pretty much covers the field, right? There's very few treaties that you couldn't fit into one or more of those categories. That's not the case. So alliances, for example, which have not yet been cashed out into specific commitments, are not covered by any of those categories, even though they are politically salient. There's a general obligation for treaties that don't fall into one of those specific categories for the president to sort of give information about their contents to the legislature, but that's as soon as the interest and safety of the state shall permit. So that's a very flexible and open-ended commitment, honoured, I think, often with long delay. Very few legal constraints then. What's the practice? Most treaties are communicated to the legislature and published most of the time at some point. Where there is secrecy is more or less in the areas that you would suspect. So alliances of different kinds, carve-ups of colonial interests, particularly ones which are likely to anger other states or the future colony concerned in some cases, and agreements between unequal polities. So this could be things like agreements about the recruitment of Gurkhas, for example, right? Or agreements for, the protection of embassy property or something like that in a state which is considered not to be on par with the leading power, which is a counterpart. And secrecy there is essentially face-saving. You're concealing from the world at large that the agreement is very one-sided. And you could say that's a sort of cynical use of secrecy, or you could say on a more positive side that it's upholding a kind of general norm of sovereign equality, which is a fictional aspiration, if not a reality. During World War II, we would add to these categories the kinds of treaties with which you'll be familiar, promises of territory in exchange for assistance during the war. So all kinds of difficult commitments are made during the war years, which are not easy to sustain afterwards in the peacemaking. What explains this pattern of publication secrecy? I think I won't say much more about this now, but it's definitely something we can come back to in terms of motives for secrecy versus publication and effects. And I think I would say part of it is inertia. So publication is the norm, and bureaucrats tend to do what the norm is. So unless they're told to do otherwise, they will follow the practice of publication. Where the question comes up, there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis in the case, right? And it depends how strongly the bureaucrats feel about the need for publication, and it depends what the interests at stake are, how that argument pans out. Now, attitudes, which I use as a very general shorthand, are the ones that you would expect, right, in the first instance. So as I've said, there's a strong kind of liberal internationalist or leftist suspicion of secrecy on a few different fronts. The less expected part of this is government officials. So as I said, where disputes arise about whether something should be published or not, you often find government officials who would like the flexibility of not publishing it. But there's also a recognition, and this was very much the case in Britain in relation to some secret treaties, involving Portugal and what would happen to the future of Portuguese colonies. There's some anxiety about the problems that secrecy creates. Once you keep something secret, you're then hampered in your ability to make other agreements, and you're hampered in your ability to answer parliamentary questions and to deal with developments which might arise. So one secret agreement can have a whole long history of distorting what happens afterwards until it's either brought to light, it's kind of denounced and got rid of, resolved in some way. So it's not the case that government officials are kind of rubbing their hands together in glee at secrecy. Actually, secrecy can be very, very difficult to manage. And from an administrative point of view, something which becomes more important as treaties proliferate after World War II, it just becomes difficult to manage the volume of obligations, keep track of them. That's where things are on the eve of World War I, and obviously the war accentuates the kind of attitudinal opposition to secrecy. 1919 brings the first international law requirement for treaty publication, Covenant of the League of Nations, every treaty or international engagement, note how broad that is, they're trying to get around the vocabulary problem, shall be registered with the Secretariat and as soon as possible published. So there's going to be a central library of treaties that will be managed by the League of Nations Secretariat. And importantly, no treaty or international engagement shall be binding until it's been registered. So the face of that text says, if you want to make an agreement in the Register of Law, it's going to be published. That's the formal legal position. The practice, I'll go into this in a second, very quickly drains the full force and effect from Article 18. And just to foreshadow what the main actors are thinking and what drives this pretty rapid defunctness of Article 18, governments and officials within the League Secretariat generally think Article 18 is a good thing, but they encounter these specific cases. They start to wonder actually about whether the empirical and normative case for the publicity, legality, peace relationship is as strong as they thought. And they can't, and this is quite important, they can't find a legal way of limiting the obligation of registration that has any integrity or robustness. Internationalists obviously do support Article 18. There's a lot of NGO lobbying against secret treaties during the war. But once we get into the terrain of arguing about Article 18 of the League Covenant, they're already sidelined. It's too technical a debate for a lot of these public groups to engage with. Let me say a little bit more about the early tests, like what essentially broke Article 18. The first challenge to it arises from a thing called the Franco-Belgian Military Accord. And I will spare you the intricate details of drafting, but this is an ideal case for how drafting is often a very, very messy process, right? Multiple iterations of the same agreement that look quite different and shift some clauses from the published to the secret and so on. Basically, there was secrecy there to protect the military details, to head off public opposition from Flemish constituencies in Belgium who weren't in favour of closer alignment with France. And there was also a sort of sensitive question about whether Britain would be enthusiastic about this close coordination absent Britain. So this is a military accord. This is exactly the type of treaty which was seen as the archetypal secret treaty and seen as really problematic. And within the British Foreign Office, there is a very clear understanding that this is a test for Article 18. So see, one official says, look, this looks like the thin end of the wedge, right? If other powers start saying we're not going to register and have published something like this, the whole principle of registration will fall to pieces. This is a make or break test case. Similarly, another official says, you know, this is basically not far removed from an offensive and defensive alliance. There's going to be a hue and cry about secret diplomacy again if this isn't registered. By the way, you can probably judge slightly from the handwriting, but that second official is a sort of very old school diplomat in the way that he thinks about things. But there's a convergence here, shall we say, on the stakes of the matter. Despite understanding that this is really significant for the meaning of and future of Article 18, Britain doesn't end up pushing France to register. Britain is probably the only power which could have had much influence on France at this point. Why not? Because there is a certain awkwardness. France is only in the position of having to make these security arrangements with Belgium because Britain has refused the more expansive kind of security commitment that France would have wanted. And the US is obviously pulling back from the League and absent from the picture. So there's a sort of political sensitivity to Britain being seen to stand in the way of this fallback position that France has devised for itself. In the League Secretariat, officials would really like this thing to be published, but the thing that they want most is for the stories in the press about a secret agreement to go away. So they're keen to find a settlement which looks like it has some integrity, but will smooth the issue over. They're more concerned about looking weak for not insisting on registration than they are about actually getting the thing registered. Another thing which is acting on the British Foreign Office at this point is that Britain itself has some agreements which the Treasury is very reluctant to register and publish. The core category of agreements which are in issue here are essentially agreements about advances and changing the terms of repayment for loans. And this is a very long-winded minute from the Treasury, and it devised, as so many instructions to legal officers are, to very clearly signal the outcome the Treasury would like to have rubber stamped by the lawyer. But basically, the Treasury makes the case that they need secrecy around these arrangements to protect the credit of the countries which are struggling with repayment, to avoid political controversy in those countries where there's kind of debates about the strength of the government and the strength of the country's finances and so on, and also to allow them to make sui generis one-off arrangements with creditors that they don't want to offer to other states, right, and to which they couldn't say no if the concession to one state had been published. A very, very strong push from the Treasury, and the Foreign Office doesn't resist this. Basically, the Foreign Office officials can see that there is a real issue here, and that there might be a case for secrecy here fostering stability or fostering kind of the re-establishment of financial stability, which is a precondition for peace. So it's actually, this is a pretty serious test for the ideological case for publicity. As I said, one approach would have been to try and limit Article 18 in some way, say that it only applies to certain categories of treaties, but that proves impossible. There's a lot of lawyers involved, they can't find a way to narrow it. However, it's clear that states are not going to apply it comprehensively. So what we end up with is a sort of Pyrrhic victory. Supporters of Article 18 keep the provision intact, but there's a kind of tacit acceptance among governments that it's not going to be applied in a strict way that it might be read on its face. And that's carried through into legal scholarship and into the Permanent Court of International Justice. So one of the judges on the bench of the Permanent Court, when it has to deal with some of these unpublished arrangements, was previously an official in the League Secretariat who basically devised a kind of compromise interpretation here, and that's then carried into adjudication. So whereas the text of Article 18 might have suggested that registration and publication is a condition of having a treaty in the first place, it just is not anything with legal force unless you register and publish, what we end up with is an interpretation of Article 18 which says you only need to register and publish if you actually want to invoke this thing before the League and use the League as an enforcement apparatus. So that's quite different. And it's up to the state essentially to choose, do you want to have that possibility of using the League apparatus or not? So whereas publicity had been something which was designed to empower publics, it ultimately left a lot of discretion to governments. That gives you the international picture. And it's important to remember how quickly Article 18 kind of recedes as a change to state practice. It's in the first few years of the League's existence, right? There are some developments domestically, though. So in the US, despite the fact that Article 18 doesn't turn out to have the force that it might have been anticipated to have, there are internationalist officials in the State Department who have relationships with the League Secretariat, and they try and get the US to cooperate in some ways with the League's registration mechanism, even though the US isn't a member. So there's a kind of voluntary compliance with sending in published treaties. In the UK, the same kind of liberal internationalist sentiment which animated a lot of the Union for Democratic Control and other NGOs at the end of the war is carried into government when Labour takes power. Which is that treaties are to be laid before Parliament between signing and ratification. The trick is that not all treaties are subject to ratification. So this convention only applies to ones which go through that double process. And you remember that not all really important treaties have that two-stage process. Looking at the records, Ponsonby here felt very strongly, he was very committed to publicity, but he was in a sense fobbed off by the Foreign Office legal advisor. I don't think Ponsonby himself really understood the limits of the convention, and it was not really debated because it became apparent actually that as treaties were submitted, there were very few people in the Commons who were really equipped to challenge the treaties they were seeing in the first place. France has no interwar changes to its constitutional apparatus. And in all of those states, aside from the domestic law reform, the treaty bureaucracy has a role to play. So in the US, the kind of State Department bureaucracy and legal function is only developing at this stage, but they have a pretty strong grip of registration and publication, and that they comply with the voluntary arrangements. In Britain, there's a very established treaty section in the Foreign Office. These are people of long experience and some degree of authority, right, in the group of officials. So they are, in a sense, vigilant about crossing the T's and dotting the I's. And that can make a difference too to the way some of these debates pan out. In France, the Ministère des Affaires étrangères has a slightly different attitude. They're much more lackadaisical, and they do not put pressure on the politicians to register. In fact, it's sometimes the opposite, right? So a story here about Foreign Office bureaucracy and its effects. To kind of give an overview of what happens in the aftermath of Article 18's weakness, I would say that developments kind of reflect the observations I just made about the Foreign Office bureaucracies. So Britain and the US are pretty careful. They try and use secrecy in ways that are, shall we say, plausibly deniable, justifiable on some bureaucratic basis. And they use secrecy in some of the same areas, typically agreements with unequal powers. So there's some kind of degree of face saving or humiliation at stake in those agreements. Trade agreements. So as protectionism takes off, it's suddenly pretty urgent to make sure that you can secure attractive arrangements with others, even at the cost of undermining sort of the systemic functioning. And towards the end of the 30s, you do see a kind of return to the sort of secret agreements in the realm of high politics. But I think here we have to see the secrecy as actually notional rather than, genuine secrecy. So careful secrecy in pretty carefully delimited veins. France more free and easy with a secrecy claim. So they're very happy to make very far-reaching claims that this is just a technical agreement or this is just a protocol, something of that kind. Those arguments don't have a lot of consistency to them, and I think they are not necessarily intended to stand up to any legal analysis. And France, because of its geopolitical position, ends up feeling constrained to make military agreements with Poland and with the little Entente countries. And it's in connection with these military accords that you see this sometimes farcical public debate where ministers are asked questions and they say, oh, there's no treaty, it's just a protocol. And you can see that that's not well understood in the public domain. As I said there, and as the fact of questioning of ministers would suggest, secrecy in a lot of these cases is not wholly secret. Either other governments know, some other governments know, or there is a general public understanding that some commitment has been made, but people don't know the details, or even the public knows all the details because there's been a leak, but the government will not avow it, will not confirm. And so it's that pattern of uncertainty rather than lack of knowledge which characterizes the arrangements. I'm coming up to my 40 minutes. I'll accelerate through the last part. Let me kind of move forward now to the post-World War II moment. We'll start with the law, although I think other aspects are more important than the law here. When we put Article 18 and the equivalent provision of the Charter side by side, we can see that the drafters of the Charter have kind of taken an ambiguous position as to what Article 102 is intended to achieve. So the second paragraph there says not that no treaty or agreement is binding until it's been registered, but rather that no party can invoke the text before the UN if it's unregistered. So that's kind of picking up the tacit interpretation of Article 18. But in the aftermath of the Charter, the US and the UK are still trying to claim in their dealings with the Soviet Union that there is an overarching obligation to publish and register. This isn't a free and easy opt for the enforcement apparatus only. But at that time that they're making the arguments, they accept internally that they themselves have not published and registered everything. Why? right? So why do we end up with an essentially narrower commitment to register and publish in the Charter to what was in the Covenant? There were a lot of opportunities for redesigning things in 1945. Why do we end up with this one? The background to the drafting suggests that the US played a major role. So there were some states that were very committed to treaty registration and publication and tried to insist on a strict requirement. Smaller states, by and large. New Zealand was particularly active on this issue. And you know, we can formulate theories about why small or medium powers would be more interested in systemic provisions of this kind. But the US State Department is keen to be a little bit circumspect. We can speculate that the US at this point is moving into a position of having more global commitments, some of which they have an interest in keeping secret. So perhaps they're suddenly seeing the attractiveness of secrecy. But the lawyers who have a key role here are not really Machiavellian about this, right? It seems from the records that what they're thinking is that Article 18 just wasn't widely embraced. There was probably a reason for that. It didn't prove enforceable. Let's kind of rein in the ambition, right? It's also the case that by 1945, there's less faith in the power of public opinion, right, to constrain conflict. And the UN, of course, is not designed to be as reliant on democratic public opinion as the League was. There's a strong executive component to the UN, initially envisaged to be backed up by military force. So in being circumspect, they're not really flying in the face of public expectation of the kind that existed in 1919. Post-World War II practice does unfold in a different context to the interwar period. So for a start, there's a lot more international cooperation and there's a lot more complexity to that cooperation. So often you find departments or agencies collaborating with peers in other states rather than running the relationship through the foreign ministry. So that creates a whole new field of internal tensions within the organs of state. On one hand, the foreign ministry is very in favour of registration and publication because it means they can control the agreement making a little bit, but they also are sometimes not up to the job of mastering the volume. So a great expansion of the material that's in issue and a greater risk that the democracies will be called out in the UN for secrecy. So in the League, you know, Britain and France having basically conceded that Article 18 didn't have full force, were not in a strong position to call out others. In the UN, you have the kind of inbuilt permanent possibility of challenge from the Soviet Union, which from the archival material did concern the Americans to some extent. It shaped the way they chose to use secrecy. Again, Britain and the US are pretty limited in their embrace. They prefer to rely on the ambiguous status of texts or to kind of have a public text and a secret side letter of some kind. France, less bothered by the rigorous demand. And again, some quite sui generis rhetoric around exceptions in their records. The sorts of areas which are an issue are, again, trade, at least prior to the kind of GATT apparatus, defense, and sort of unequal power relations. And interestingly, in the unequal power relations, you now see the UK in the position of the mendicant power, in a sense, wanting to conceal their weakness in some instances of dealings with the US. On the defense point, there are people here who know more about this than I do. I just want to underline that there's a couple of different phenomena going on. On the one hand, there are what you might think of as, broadly speaking, legitimate arrangements or ones which would not be a surprise to people. So the detail of how one implements, for example, NATO commitments, people generally would have some sense that there's activity going on and that it's being coordinated in some way. At the other end of the spectrum, you have real kind of one-off renegade things like the Sèvres Protocol, the British-French-Israeli arrangement for essentially offensive operations in Egypt. The underlying action there is unlawful, which is not the case with the secrecy in the NATO realm. So quite a broad spectrum of different instances. There's a couple of developments in the domestic sphere which reflect increasing anxiety about secrecy. So in the US, Congress wakes up to the sheer volume of paper, right, and of commitments which are being made, sometimes quite informally, on very important issues. And there's an attempt to consolidate what's going on. The Case of Blocky Act, which is later made in the early 70s, strengthened in the late 70s, provides for any international agreement, so not just Article 2 treaties, to go to Congress. There's arrangements for secret transmission of classified agreements, and there's an inherent executive privilege, which means that the executive can withhold even things which should otherwise be treated as classified agreements. And that's essentially a systematization. It's motivated by the desire to give Congress greater oversight, but for the State Department, it also helps them rein in this kind of agreement making by other agencies that they can't control. In Britain, despite isolated controversies, the Ponsonby Rule remains pretty much the only serious regulation. And in France, if anything, the control on secrecy goes backwards, right? Let me just say something about where we are today. On a legal perspective, we have Article 102 of the Charter, which is not demanding. It doesn't make registration and publication a condition of having a treaty. And domestic law of these three states, there remain possibilities for secrecy, right? As we've seen, those are kind of reined in by things like the Case of Blocky Act, but they still exist. There's been, in practice, a systematization of the boundary between what counts as a treaty and what doesn't. So the UK actually has been a leader in pioneering this category of the non-binding agreement, right? The Memorandum of Understanding is often a code for this, which can be 50 pages long, as detailed as a treaty, drafted in contractual terms, but somehow said not to be a treaty because they don't wish to publish it. There's kind of routinized secrecy, either through non-binding agreements or through actually binding treaties that are often kind of split between the published and the secret element. In categories like base agreements, information sharing, status of forces, and this is a really interesting and developing area, immigration cooperation. So the way states make arrangements for pushing back asylum seekers or for relocating asylum seekers for processing is an area of evolving secrecy, shall we say. And from a liberal democratic perspective, that's actually almost more of a challenge for us to think about than the defense side of things. As with the 1950s to 90s, we have on one hand this kind of systematized secrecy, which covers acts which are not prima facie unlawful. And then we have more ad hoc sui generis arrangements, which we don't know a lot about, but which seem from reports to have had some kind of quasi-legal component, covering things like drone strikes in Pakistan in particular, and black sites to which the US rendered individuals for detention and torture. So we don't know enough about those to speculate, but there seems to have been some attempt to use some legal tools to make this stuff possible. Interestingly, although you have the embedding of this secrecy, there's really limited discussion about this as a general principle today relative to what we saw in 1919. In the UK, for example, in 2010, they finally put the Ponsonby Rule in statute and kept the limited nature of it virtually undiscussed in the statutory drafting process, how restrictive that publicity requirement was. Okay, so for my overarching project, what I get from this treaties work is the possibility of secret legally binding commitments is served. And although there are different incentives acting in particular cases, overall we can say that the preservation of this secrecy was as much the work of liberal internationalists as it was your kind of old school diplomat with the looping handwriting. And it happened before the 1930s. So there's a kind of historical arc that things were generally speaking compliant with the League vision in the 20s, and then as the fascist threat rose in the 30s, things changed. That's not the case. So this compromise on secrecy was made early. And that, again, is thought-provoking for us. Underlines, I think, a question about what states are doing in insisting that you can make legal agreements secretly. We can talk a bit more about that in the questions if of interest. And this general line that it's important to get beyond the rhetoric of transparency. We need to know actually what's happening, and then we can think normatively more clearly. Going beyond the confines of my own project, I also think there's really interesting discussions to have, and that may be the case with some people listening or here, about how we go about mapping what's happening now. The archives are not open, but there might be other sources of information. The whole area of secrecy between illiberal or undemocratic states is really understudied. We assume that they use secrecy quite a lot, but on the other hand, they're the states which really need the reputational leverage of making their commitments public. So I think there's something quite interesting there. We need to map where treaty making fits relative to other modes of commitment now. We have so many organizational loci that what you previously would have had to agree in a treaty, you can now just kind of make as an internal rule of an organization and then have implemented, right? And there's no systematization of those internal rules of organization. They're not treated like treaties. It will be interesting to think about the relational effects of sort of changing hegemonic patterns. If we have the rise of powers which are less committed to democracy and transparency, does that change the general web of relationships and commitments to openness? And importantly, what's the effect, either systemically or in individual cases, of making something secret or public? How do we study that? It's actually a lot more complex than it might initially appear. That's all empirical. Then there's the normative question. What do you do with the knowledge you get from inquiry of this kind? And that's sort of a broader philosophical point. I'll leave it there.
Thanks to everyone who joined us online and stayed with us online. And to all of you here in this room, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you will join me in thanking Megan with a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks to those online.